Hello there. Now last year for the Ides of March, when 15th of March came along, I did a talk on Julius Caesar as a general. Now this year I thought, well, let's look at the obvious associations of the Ides of March. Let's look at the conspiracy against Caesar and his assassination. Probably won't really go into the aftermath of that because that's another big topic and we can save that for another time. Now I'm not quite sure which day this video will go out on. I think it probably won't be the 15th itself. I'll put it into the normal sequence of my Wednesday morning a video is released, just because we've got into that pattern now, and as far as possible it's probably better to stick to that, otherwise YouTube seems to get terribly confused. And anyway, it allows people to think, oh yes, let's have a look, let's see what's out there. So this morning we're going to talk about Caesar's last months, thank you Gussie, the cat who's contributing from the hallway out there, and the conspirators as well. We'll look at as many of them as we can, although it is important to remember that quite a few are just names and several of the 60 or so are not known at all, are not identified. But let's begin with one of the oddest aspects of it. We tend to see this assassination as inevitable, and there's a lot of scholarly debate over whether Caesar is killed for what people think he might become or killed for what he already is. But there is this sense that Caesar makes all these mistakes, the senators murder him, and then Augustus learns from this experience and decades later will not make the same mistakes and therefore survives, founds the Principate, reigns for 40 plus years. Which is judging everything through hindsight, this sense that there's an inevitability and that we know exactly what's going to happen. But look at this, from 45 BC, when Caesar was fighting the last campaign of the Civil War, Gnaeus Pompey, the oldest son of Pompey the Great, who'd been killed in Egypt, had, with the support of Labienus and other remaining senior opponents of Caesar, had raised an army in Spain. Remember, Spain was an area closely associated with Pompey and his family for a long time. There'd been a campaign there in 49. Caesar's representative on the spot had made a complete pig's breakfast of it afterwards and had caused mutiny amongst his army. So there were failures there on both sides, but this was a region where there were lots of people with connections to Pompey and his family. Caesar went off to fight the campaign that culminated in the Battle of Munda in 45 BC, but it was pretty tough. It's not as well described as the others. This is probably the least literary of the books continuing Caesar's commentaries on Gaul and on the Civil War, and less detailed, though it has some interesting aspects to it, which we'll look at another day when we get around to it. But Cassius Longinus, the man who with Brutus will be the leader of the conspiracy, wrote to Cicero whilst this campaign was going on, whilst there wasn't much reliable news in Rome of what was happening, and very clearly worried that Caesar might lose. He said this: "Now to return to matters affecting the Republic, report what's happening in Spain. I'm really worried by this, and would rather stick with the old clement master than have a new and cruel one. You know how fatuous Gnaeus is. You know how he mistakes cruelty for courage, and how he thinks we always mock him. I'm afraid he'll repay our wit with the sword in peasant fashion." So this is Cassius, man who's going to plunge his dagger into Julius Caesar, talking about Caesar as the old clement master. Yes, okay, he's dominant, he's got there by civil war, but he's a lot nicer than Gnaeus Pompey, son of the man for whom I fought in 49-48 BC against Julius Caesar. I don't want Gnaeus in charge. Gnaeus is a thug. Gnaeus is, well, clearly doesn't have a very high opinion of Gnaeus Pompey, presumably through encounters with him during the Civil War, but perhaps beforehand as well. I mean, Gnaeus is still pretty young at this point by Roman standards. So you have a situation where barely a year before the assassination, one of the main people to be involved in it seems keener on Caesar than the alternative that's likely at the time. Now obviously you can say, well, once Gnaeus Pompey is defeated, as Caesar manages to crush the army at Munda, and the leading Pompeians either are killed or commit suicide, that it's safe then to criticize your old clement master. You can start to think rather more hostile thoughts about him because you're no longer worried about the alternative. That alternative has gone. So that's really what we're dealing with, is what's happening? Why is there this change? Is it simply of those two alternatives I prefer Caesar over Gnaeus Pompey, but now there's only Caesar, well, let's see, maybe I can get rid of Caesar. There's an element of that, but let's consider what happens. There is a great danger when people discuss Caesar's dictatorship and the last years of his life and his plans for the future, that they forget that he has very little time. He is spending most of his time in these years fighting the civil wars, away from Italy, away from Rome. You have these periods of he's rarely in Rome for more than 6 months or so, and even then he might not be in Rome permanently, he might be moving around Italy. The impression you get from source after source is that Caesar is working every hour that the day offers at this time, dealing with petitions, organising things, legislation, administration, appointments, all of these jobs. The sort of long slog of work that emperors like Augustus, the good emperors, will take on. Because after all, you're dealing with a state that has been in chaos for a very long time. You've just had an intensive few years of civil wars that's disrupted everything, where you've had different representatives claiming to be the legitimate men on the spot of the Roman Republic go to a region and say to these communities, I want this, I want that, you're in charge, no, in this case, he's superior to you, and so on. And then somebody else comes along and changes all those arrangements, or perhaps confirms them, but there's that uncertainty. And that spreads to Italy as well. More generally, lots of institutions of the city have not been functioning properly because of the disruption of civil war. When the Romans are busy killing each other, it's hard for the state to function naturally. So Caesar has a lot to do, added to his grand ambitions. So this is a man who's just reformed the calendar, who is trying to introduce all sorts of innovations, change things, who's bringing up many of the issues he's touched on in the past. So land redistribution of publicly owned land. He's providing land for veterans, for the poor in Rome, but trying to do that without disrupting the communities where these people are going. So Caesar is doing a lot. He's very, very busy. And you get that reflected in some of the sources. So Suetonius, obviously writing later, but talks about Caesar as tired in these last months. Caesar gave the impression to some of his friends that he did not wish to live any longer and took no precautions due to his failing health. Some also say that he declared that it was more important for the Republic than himself to go on living, for he had already ample glory and power. However, if anything happened to him, there would be no peace for the state, which would relapse into civil war of a much worse kind. Obviously, Suetonius was writing with hindsight. He knows that Caesar will be murdered and the state will relapse into civil war of a much worse kind. But it is useful. It's that sense of a Caesar who is doing so much, who has been fighting for a very long time, where again, he's been the man who's had to make all the decisions. You cannot pass the buck when you're the supreme commander, which he's been in campaign after campaign. It's up to you to make things work, to make sure that you win, and the blame is yours when it fails. So he's fatigued. He's no longer young. He's 56, coming into his 56th year. Probably. Again, we've got these doubts about the actual year of his birth, but most people opt for 100 BC, which does seem to fit the best. So he's well into middle age. Bear in mind that in the Roman system, you stand for the consulship at around about 42. So 40s are really seen as your sort of political prime. And yes, you might be lucky and get a second consulship in your early 50s, but third consulships are very rare and tend to be emergency measures. You don't quite have the equivalent that you get in Greek and Macedonian history of these rather geriatric men going around still doing important things, partly because this is a system that elects its officials. It's not a monarchy, so you don't just stay in power because you're still alive and you happen to be king. But Caesar is probably, on the verge of things. His health is a big question, and there are those who like to claim that, because of this Suetonius thing, that his failing health here, that he's getting worse, whether it's epilepsy, whether it's something else, whether there are related problems with this exhaustion. That's, from the immense amount of effort. This is somebody who drives himself incredibly hard, who is extremely active. That is bound to take a toll, and yet some individuals in history seem to be able to keep doing this for a very long time and keep on going. So again, it's the old thing that many of the more successful leaders, they're not quite normal. They are a bit different from the rest of us because they seem to be able to put in these extra hours and just keep the ambition, the determination to succeed, to do things, to achieve what they want to tends to take over any other concerns in a way that for most of us it doesn't. You know, we want to do other things as well. There's the other comment that in 46 BC, you know, Cicero talks about Caesar saying, "I've lived long enough for either nature or glory." You know, it's basically the sense of this weary old man. Old by Roman political standards, again, that, you know, I've done everything, I've achieved everything. And you could argue that you have a Caesar who has, if you see him very much as a traditional Roman aristocrat, wanting to succeed, wanting to get to the top of society, be recognized by all his peers as the best Roman of his day, the greatest aristocrat, the greatest commander, the greatest servant of the Republic, then he's achieved all of that. And what's worse, most of the generation that he would have liked to approve of all of this and to accept, okay, yeah, fair enough, you know, I've competed with you, I've always thought I was great, but actually you've done all this, and I've got to say, yeah, it is pretty good. But Pompey's dead, Crassus is dead, many of his peers, Cato, Catullus, you know, these people who've dominated most of his political life have all gone. There aren't too many contemporaries around that he can respect. And even some of those, like the Ciceros of this world, they've changed sides, so their relationship is not straightforward, though again we'll come back to Cicero and Caesar in a little while. So Caesar's very busy, he's slogging very hard, he's introducing all this new legislation, he's bringing in all these rulings, he's appointing people, he's listening to petitions. No coincidence that Cleopatra turns up at Rome around about this time. I certainly don't buy the idea that you'll get in particularly Cleopatra biographies and those that tend to look only from that perspective, that she's turned up in 46 and has been in Rome for 18 months, 2 years. There's no real hint of that in the sources. She probably just visited twice. There's very little point her being there when Caesar is not there for a very long time. But this is a client ruler who wants to make sure that they are still the approved client ruler of the leader of the Roman Republic, who is Caesar at that time. So there's lots of people in or around Rome wanting things from you. Obviously, in Cleopatra's case, you've got the relationship with Caesar, probably genuine love as well as political expediency on both sides. So there's more to it than that. But again, that's an extra element he's got to fit in during all this time. Cleopatra often will come to dominate accounts of these months in a way that is not reflected in the sources and seems to be modern imagination. We know what's going to happen with her and Antony later on, the role she will play in the rise of Augustus as the enemy, the menace to decent Roman traditions and Roman rule and Roman Republic. But we're anticipating all of that. You know, bear in mind Caesar has had other affairs in these months and years as well. So Caesar's busy, Caesar's tired, but it is very hard from the sources to see a sense of his health failing so badly that people expect him to die very soon. Even the assumption that Cicero will come out with later on, that if Caesar had gone off for his projected 3-year war, first to the Balkans, then against the Parthians, that he wouldn't have returned alive. Now, that seems to be based on Cicero's perception, or at least how he'd like to remember Caesar's health. It might be that he thinks the Parthians are so dangerous they're going to kill Caesar, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The main point is as well, the conspirators wouldn't have acted if they'd expected Caesar to die. You know, they clearly think he's going to be around for some time. That's at least part of their motivation, and that's why they strike when they do. So a lot of people didn't expect him to die. And amongst the rumours of the propaganda, you've got all this talk about him being allowed to, you know, beget children with any wife that he chooses and all this sort of thing, and there'll be legitimate heirs and all that sort of stuff. We'll come back to that in a minute, but it had to be plausible propaganda, even if it's, you know, at least remotely plausible. But I think the idea that Caesar's condition has deteriorated so much that people think, you know, he's on his last legs, he's not going to be around much longer. If that were true, it would nothing that follows would really make much sense. Anyway, let's talk about, again, Caesar and Cicero, because there's an interesting letter from when Caesar visited Cicero in December 45 BC. So he's come back from the Spanish campaign, he's got a few months late in 45, and then you'll get just the 2.5 months of 44. That's the remainder of his life, though of course we don't know that at this point. They're on the coast of Campania. They're at Puteoli, modern Pozzoli. You've got some interesting archaeology there. If you're ever in the area, people tend to forget it because it's near, it's Bay of Naples, so it's near Pompeii, Herculaneum, that are more spectacular. But the Pozzoli stuff is very good as well. When the museums there are open, the amphitheatre there in particular is worth a look. But if the underground stuff is also of the port city, if that's open, that's well worth a look. Sorry, digression. Anyway. Caesar turns up to visit Cicero in one of his villas. He's brought with him Balbus, the senator who's originally from Gades in Spain, an escort, big party, some 2,000 men. So he's still moving around with some pomp, ceremony and style, and stops for a night at a villa near Cicero's, and Cicero invites him over to dinner on the 19th of December 45 BC. And Cicero borrowed guards while this visit was going on, presumably gladiators or something like that, or just some burly men who were maintained by some of the landlords to protect their property from a neighbour. Seems to have been suspicious that otherwise some of this entourage might have got a little bit out of hand. That's possibly true. I mean, Caesar talks in the commentaries on the Civil War that he won't let his troops enter a town under cover of darkness. He waits till the next morning because he doesn't think he can control them in the sort of the dark streets and alleyways. Obviously, Civil War was a period when soldiers are likely to feel that they can do more, get away with things they couldn't in peacetime. They were prosecuted then, but if you're doing this to an enemy or a neutral, then who's going to say anything? Doesn't mean everybody's gone like that, but a proportion of your army is perhaps a little bit wilder than it might have been, and maybe there's the concern they'll still be like that, although in fact there is no evidence of any problems whatsoever. In the morning, Caesar remained in the neighbour's villa until the 7th hour, early afternoon, admitting no one. I understand he was busy in his accounts with Balbus. Later, he walked along the shore. After the 8th hour, he bathed. Then he listened to the matter of Mamura without altering his expression. We're not quite sure what this problem was. Mamura was one of his associates who had a very dubious reputation for overindulgence, for corruption, getting his hand caught in the till, this sort of thing. He's probably the subject, well, possibly anyway, of some of Catullus's more vitriolic verses. There's also stuff directed against Caesar and probably Labienus as well. There as well. What this particular scandal was, or rumoured scandal, we're not sure. It may have been because he was known for having a very extravagant lifestyle. Caesar had brought in sumptuary legislation restricting what you could spend on entertainment, clothes, feasting, this sort of thing. It's a feature that recurs every generation or so in Roman society under the Republic. This idea that to be proper Romans, we need to show restraint. We can't get too luxurious, too vulgar, essentially. We shouldn't be parading our wealth. We should always remember we're fellow citizens with everybody else in the Republic. So he's probably breached something like that, but we don't quite know. Anyway, Caesar was rubbed down and had dinner. He was taking a course of emetics, and so he ate and drank freely and without concern. The dinner was grand and well presented, not merely that, but well cooked and properly seasoned, and if you ask, all went well. And at the same time, his followers, including lots of slaves and freedmen, because again, many of your administrators as well as body servants and others and functionaries, they were entertained, the most senior of them in style. The main dinner, Cicero says, no talk of the affairs of state, plenty of discussion of literature. To answer your question, he was happy and enjoyed it. And that's the theme. Caesar's staff on campaign are renowned for their literary tastes, both in terms of composition. Quintus Cicero wrote all these plays whilst he was in winter quarters in Gaul, but also it's the manner, it's the idea this is what gentlemen should talk about, and we're not doing politics, we're just being proper Roman educated aristocrats. Cicero ruefully declares, well, dinner was successful, but it's not the sort of visitor you want to popping in all the time. But he obviously felt that he couldn't not invite Caesar when Caesar's nearby. So you get this impression Caesar's busy, but he's still a charming companion for dinner. Sometime in 44 BC, so very early on, Cicero went to visit Caesar in Rome at Caesar's house, which is the Regia, the palace, the old royal building is now associated with the Pontifex Maximus, so it's just there on the edge of the Forum Romanum. Kept waiting for some time before being ushered into his presence. Later he recalled Caesar saying, this is again a story Cicero tells after Caesar's death, "Can I have any doubt that I am deeply loath when Marcus Cicero has to sit and wait and cannot simply come to see me as he wishes? If ever there is an easy-mannered man, then it is he. Yet I have no doubt that he hates me." So Caesar on the whole seems relaxed, but he does seem to be, he's not delusional to the extent that he thinks everybody loves him, and he realizes that people like Cicero, really do hate what he's done, and by extension him. You get these outbursts of temper, but there's nothing really to suggest that he's becoming tyrannical. If anything, he's quite sensitive to the mood of this regretting, but there is the priority, as far as he's concerned, comes back to the comments earlier on from Suetonius that there's no point killing me because the state needs me, I'm doing lots of good work. He is busy, he is slogging, he is getting things done, and he has to maintain this level of this pace of work, as well as some caution and security around his position, because these things need to be sorted out, and he realizes that this means he can't do things properly, he can't do things tactfully, and that will add to the fact that people dislike him. But this is not someone who's completely unaware, this is not a Caligula and Nero who's just doing what they like, and he doesn't seem to be more tyrannical. His character does not seem to have changed profoundly. I suspect that's rather the point. Now, the last few months are times of a few famous incidents. Again, it's notable that we don't have Cicero's letters to Atticus for this period, for either side of the assassination. The letters were published after Cicero's death, by which time Augustus was well on the rise, and Atticus, one of his daughters, had married Agrippa. So there's someone who's decided he's going to be in with whoever wins, as Atticus had always managed to do. So he may well have said something, or Cicero said something that implied Atticus' attitudes were a little bit different at the time. But it does mean it's harder to track. So most of the evidence we have for those last months come from Plutarch, Suetonius, Appian, these later sources, Dio to some extent. They are heavily influenced by the propaganda war that occurred after Caesar's murder, because after all, the civil war that develops is fought between the men who murdered Caesar, or who thought that was a great thing, and are telling you that, look, if we hadn't done that, all these terrible things would have happened. He would have got worse, he would have got more tyrannical, it would have led to this, that, and the other. And Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, and others who are arguing the opposite, that, this was a terrible tragedy, that Caesar was murdered, Caesar was decent, Caesar was ruling well, these people were ungrateful so-and-sos, they killed him, and think how great, this is how great things would have been if they hadn't done this, because Caesar was doing a really good job. One question that does seem to have been raised is this whole idea of just what Caesar was. He's got the title of dictator, which has been voted to him, and dictator for life, but monarchy, the idea of somebody wanting to be a king, is part of the rhetoric of Roman politics. The Gracchi have been accused of wanting monarchy. Cicero has been accused of wanting monarchy during the Catilinarian conspiracy. At various times, people come along, and if you don't like your opponent, you say, well, they're so good, they're so successful, they just want to be the only one ruling a republic. On January the 26th, Caesar celebrated the traditional Latin festival on the Alban Hills outside Rome, and the Senate gave him permission to celebrate an ovation. An ovation is one step down from a triumph. In a triumph, the general returns to the city and parades through the centre in a chariot. In an ovation, he rides a horse. He rides back to Rome accompanied by a grand procession. During the parade, someone in the crowd hailed him as King Rex. And of course, this is the time when Caesar replies, I am not king, but Caesar. Marcius Rex, Marcius the king, Marcius king, that was a family name. Julius Caesar is a family name. So he's sort of like, I don't want to be, I don't need to be king. I'm Caesar. You know me. Around about this time, you have the bit that you get reflected in Shakespeare. Marullus and Flavus, or Caius Epidius Marullus, Lucius Caesius Flavus, had taken down a royal diadem, a band. Remember, it's not a crown as such as we would perceive it. It's simply a plain headband, like the ones you see on images of Cleopatra. It's the Hellenistic symbol of royalty. One of these had been put on, or something that looked like it, on one of Caesar's statues in the Forum. This was taken down. They arrest the man who raised the shout of king. And Caesar's annoyed, and it is one of those things where it's very hard for him to do the right thing, and his critics win either way, because Caesar's dismissed this, said, "Oh, this is ridiculous, some fool saying something. He just treats it as a joke. No, I'm not king, I'm Caesar. You know me." This makes an issue of it, because this means that the tribunes are saying this man genuinely is trying to promote a revolution which would turn Caesar into a king, would overthrow the republic that's existed for more than 4 centuries, and turn us back into the monarchy that we've been before, and dim memories of how bad that was. But of course it means Caesar cannot not take a stance, because either he's seen as well, he seemed to be encouraging that Caesar didn't arrest them, Caesar was happy with this. So Caesar protests. The tribunes then complain they're not being allowed to perform their duty, so they're very much standing on their honour, their status. Oh, we as tribunes of the plebs, we protect the people, and we're doing the right thing. This dictator is interfering with us. Caesar summons the Senate, condemns the men, saying that they've placed him in the impossible position. He either accepts an insult or acts harshly against his true nature. For him, this wasn't a big deal, but they've turned it into a big deal. He's either got to accept that somebody gets punished for something that he didn't really think is a crime and was about him and a personal comment on him anyway, or he has to oppose tribunes, he has to do things to tribunes. Bear in mind, one of the causes he's promoted at the beginning of the Civil War was the outrages committed to tribunes Curio and Antony. So again, it's carefully done. Flavus and Marullus don't. It's unlikely that they are innocent in this. They are clearly thinking, oh yeah, each step we go, this puts Caesar in a bad place. Someone suggests the death penalty. He doesn't want this, so they gets them removed from office. So again, people are saying either they're flattering him or they're trying to stir it up even more. This is put forward by another tribune, so you're coming back to the idea that you have with the Gracchi, with Tiberius Gracchus, that you can depose your opponent because he is opposing the will of the people, and that if they vote for it, that's legal. Caesar asks Flavus's father to disinherit his son because you've got 2 more gifted sons than him. But however, the man refuses to do this, understandably enough, and Caesar doesn't push it. So again, it's difficult because in one sense, he's opposing the tribune's rights that he's fought a civil war to defend, or at least one of the reasons. But everything he does is milder. He is not the one arguing for executions, and the tribunes have sort of made this happen. They've escalated the thing. So it's the sort of situation where Caesar can't really win. If he stays as the self-image and the sort of public image he's tried to present of this clement man, this mild man who is working hard for the state. But he's also a man who's fought a civil war to protect his honour as well as that of the tribunes. So, again, if you allow people to attack you in the aristocratic mindset, then that weakens your auctoritas, your influence. So none of this is simple. You then come into February, and on the 15th you've got the Lupercalia, and this sort of fertility ritual with these priests, augurs like Mark Antony running through the street, just clad in skins, flicking people with whips, this sort of thing, which of course culminates in Antony offering a diadem to Caesar, who then publicly refuses it several times, and the crowd cheers. Again, you can see this, you've got it in the Shakespeare version of, is Caesar being more reluctant to do this? Is he really hoping the crowd will acclaim him and he can take it and say, yes, I'm going to become king? On the whole, it seems unlikely. This seems like maybe a sort of botched attempt. Again, the problem with all of these things is once a question is raised for a prominent politician, anything they say is going to draw attention to that accusation, that charge. It's very hard to clear yourself. If you have to start saying, no, I haven't been embezzling from the petty cash, or no, I haven't been mistreating my staff, or anything like that, it draws attention to the fact that people are claiming you have. There's only so far you can ignore these things, especially when the issues become big, and the human instinct is to sort of explain, no, that wasn't me, I didn't do that, that's not what happened at all. Maybe they're trying to do that. Maybe they've staged this as something that will show very clearly, I don't want to be king. Look, Antony's offered me this, and I've said no. Antony's my fellow consul, and yet I've turned it down in public. What more evidence do you need to prove that I don't want to be king? On the other hand, Cicero will later say, claim, again, it's in the context of the Philippics and his attacks on Antony, that it's Antony who kills Caesar because of this gesture down there. I suppose you could argue, as some people have, this is Antony getting, ambitious and thinking, well, actually, Caesar does need to be king, let's try and force his hand. If I present this to him and the people acclaim him, he'll have to give in. Or has Antony come up with this bright idea of this is showing people how we won't, Caesar's never going to become king because even if everybody demands it, he won't do it. And also keep doing it very publicly so everybody can see. It doesn't quite work. You can think of a lot of failed attempts by politicians in recent years to get across their manifesto or their pledge to this, that and the other. And sometimes these symbols work, sometimes they really fall flat and make you look ridiculous. This one doesn't shut the issue down. So whichever way you look at it, it doesn't succeed. It's an attempt, and it just, in a sense, draws attention to it. Now, you do have other rumours around this time of Caesar being, these excessive honours are going to be voted to him. It's hard to know. The idea, rumour of a prophecy that only a king could defeat the Parthians and all this sort of thing. Again, because of the propaganda war that goes on after Caesar's death in the civil war then, it's very, very hard to know what was actually there. And this is one of those times when we really do miss Cicero. This point in his letters to Atticus from these months, because it probably would have given us some more gossip, some more rumour. But that's how it is. You have, of course, connected with these honours the story of when the delegation, either late 45 or early 44, so it would depend who was going to be the consuls, go to Caesar and report that the Senate has voted him this whole series of honours. He's sitting down conducting business on his magistrate's chair as dictator. When they arrive, he doesn't stand up to greet them, but addresses them sitting down. And there are various stories that he's about to rise when one of his associates, one of his friends, stops him. Again, this is a no-win situation for Caesar, because on technical legal grounds, he's dictator, so he doesn't have to stand for anybody. And all other magistrates have lesser imperium and status than him. So if he had stood up, that might show, people could say, well, he's not really treating his office with the proper respect. He's trying to flatter the Senate, trying to flatter the leaders, all this sort of thing. Because he doesn't, he's considered to be rude. He's sitting there and, not showing proper respect to the Senate when the Senate's coming to vote him all these honours. Many of the honours are ridiculous, and he turns down a lot. They are the sort of thing that perhaps people just, from pure sycophancy have voted to him. Perhaps also there's people stirring it up, saying, well, if we keep on saying, I propose in the Senate that we give Caesar the right to have more than one wife to beget children, all this sort of thing. That one probably didn't come through, but that's one of the rumoured ones. Or that he can have, a cult associated with him that is moving very closely towards divine honour, so it probably never gets to that stage in his lifetime. But something about his genius and all this sort of thing. I can stand up in the Senate and say this, and we'll be able to say, well, look, it's because I think Caesar's so great, he's done all these wonderful things. But also, if he accepts it, it looks bad. And again, simply that it's been discussed and proposed and passed by the Senate makes him look bad. But also, when it actually comes to a vote, how many senators are going to stand up and say, well, no, this is terrible, this is outrageous, it's completely against our traditions, and, what's Caesar done to deserve this? So, lots of nervous people in a Senate that's over 900 strong now, many of them Caesar's supporters have come in, and quite a few of them not experienced senators because they're new to the job, and in some cases you've got people from Transalpine Gaul and the like. So all this idea that this is a Senate that isn't quite acting as normal anyway. So in so many of these situations, Caesar can't really win. And there are people who are clearly doing things to make him look bad. But the basic reality of it all is that Caesar is dictator and dictator for life. He's about to go off on this 3-year campaign, but presumably he will return. Talking about sort of the idea of a monarch and of heirs is all rather premature because there's nobody really old enough at this point. He doesn't have any children. His daughter Julia has died. have legitimate children anyway. Caesarion doesn't count, even if Caesar has given him some degree of acknowledgement, which again is much debated in the aftermath of Caesar's death. Cleopatra and Caesarion will play a big role in this story at this point if you're only focusing on them. But they just simply don't figure in any of the traditions as this being a big issue. That Cleopatra is installed in one of Caesar's houses, sort of villas, basically suburban things. It's outside the pomerium, outside the formal boundary of the city, because she's a queen and royalty is not supposed to come within the city, not ruling royalty anyway. But, Cicero barely mentions her even in the months before, and even later. He doesn't talk about this as a big deal. It's not there in the sources that everybody thinks Caesar's got his mistress, wants to make her his queen, all this sort of thing. He wants to move the capital to Alexandria, all these wacko rumours that you get in the months that follow. It all seems to be invented. But again, think of some of the very dodgy press stories that you get these days, let alone the rumour you will hear in any society association, let alone in a sort of military context or thing. The scuttlebutt that goes around, much of which is just plain wrong, and stories that gather more and more details and get embellished as they go along, but are not based on any truth whatsoever. So all of that's happening, and in this nervous environment. But it does seem to be that everybody's looking at Caesar, and he is dictator. He is one man with supreme permanent power. The whole point of the Roman Republic is to avoid one man or one group having that permanent supreme power. Therefore, accepting a dictator for any time, and one who has supposedly said that Sulla was illiterate for resigning, isn't talking about resigning and laying down his powers, is 50, coming up to 56, could live on another 10, 20, even 30 years, who knows. The situation could be very different. He could dominate the Roman world for a long time. That seems to be foremost in people's minds. So you end up with about 60 senators eventually joining together in the plot to assassinate Caesar. There have been rumours of other conspiracies before this, but nothing's really come of any of them. Until early 44 BC, Caesar has had a bodyguard of Spanish auxiliaries, perhaps dismounted cavalry, that's followed him around, that presumably are some of the people who've been in that party when he goes down to stay near Cicero. He very publicly dismissed them early in 44 when the Senate voted to form a bodyguard of senators and equestrians for him and swore an oath of loyalty to him. Now, Cicero has been given a bodyguard of young equestrians in the Catilinarian crisis, this sort of thing. It's not new. And in this case, they're never actually formed. So for the next few weeks, the rest of his life in Rome, Caesar doesn't have a formal bodyguard. I mean, whether or not there were some of the time some burly slaves around, perhaps, but he doesn't have the escort, the bodyguard that he had before. Assassination plot is pretty large, but you're still talking, 7% or so of the Senate? The Senate's 950, 960-ish by this time. 60 or so people get involved. Perhaps a few non-senators as well, equestrians and others, but basically it's a senatorial conspiracy. But the idea that the Senate murdered Caesar is even less true than the idea that the Senate fought against Caesar in the Civil War. These are always minority groups, and this is quite a small minority. Most of them, though, ironically enough, had actually been fought on Caesar's side during the Civil War. They'd been Caesarians then. And quite a few of them, at least a handful anyway, have held fairly high rank. So let's look at a few. Some of the less famous ones. We've got Gaius Trebonius. He crops up several times in the Gallic War commentaries. He's served most of those campaigns, as far as we can see, largely as a legatus, a legate, a senior subordinate. Caesar routinely puts these men in charge of a legion, and there's a fair chance that they stay with the same legion for a fair time. So they're sort of predecessors of the Augustan system, which will have a legatus legionis, permanent commander of a legion, which you still don't formally have in Caesar's day, but he's moving towards this as a sort of matter of routine, even if it isn't officially. That's the regulation of how we do things. During the Civil War, he's presided over the siege of Marseille in southern Gaul, rewarded with the suffect consulship in 45 BC after Caesar's return from Spain. Now, a suffect consul replaces one of the two consuls at the start of the year when that man steps down from office. Occasionally it's because they die. You've got Caninius Rebilus, the man who's consul for a day at the end of the year because his predecessor had dropped dead. Normally, though, Caesar's starting to use this thing which will become common under the Principate, whereby he steps back. He's been consul at the start of the year. He steps back, allows somebody else to get the office. Bear in mind as well, at this point, Caesar has an awful lot of followers, supporters to reward for their loyal service to him during the Civil War in particular. Then you've got Decimus Junius Brutus, who's the sort of the less famous Brutus, cousin of the one we all know. His mother was Sempronia. She'd been heavily associated with Catiline and other men involved in his conspiracy. Sallust gives this rather scathing view of her as, very bright, very intelligent, but morally a little bit questionable. Better to, able to dance and play the lyre better than any good woman should be able to do, and all this sort of thing. So, but again, this shows someone who's coming from a family that has associations with key figures in Roman politics, even if in Catiline's case it all goes horribly wrong. He's fought with distinction in Gaul. He's been given some major independent commands by Caesar, and he's been named consul for 42 BC, so he's marked down for the high honour that Trebonius has already held. He's even listed as one of the secondary heirs in Julius Caesar's will. So, this is someone Caesar has a fondness for. Sempronia is one of the few aristocratic women named at this time that Caesar isn't associated with romantically. So, it doesn't even seem to be that sort of connection. But he just seems to have liked him, thought highly of him. He's done well under him during the Gallic Wars, has the promise of future honours. Servius Sulpicius Galba, another legatus from the Gallic Wars. However, he stood for consulship for 49 BC and failed. Now remember, that's in the autumn before the Civil War. It's part of the build-up to the Civil War, but he stood for office then. And maybe there's some bitterness that Caesar didn't support him as well as he could have done. Bear in mind, everything is very, very highly charged at this time, and Caesar has other preoccupations. There's a wonderful letter from Servius Sulpicius Galba describing the Battle of Forum Gallorum, fought against Mark Antony in 43 BC, which we'll come back to at some point. Perhaps on its own. We might look at that battle on one occasion, but also it's interesting in the way it presents how a Roman commander, a senior officer, is seeing a battle that's only just been fought. So he seems to have borne some sort of grudge against Caesar. Maybe it's to do with that consulship, but we're not entirely sure. You've got Lucius Minucius Bassus. He seems to be disappointed because Caesar wouldn't give him a provincial command when he asked for it. And it seems to be that there was probably good reason for this, that he was thought of as greedy, rapacious, the sort of man to turn into a Verres or one of these really bad governors, and Caesar simply didn't trust him. He gave him other things, but he wouldn't give him what he asked for. So you've got men who've served Caesar before, but haven't in some cases got all the rewards for this that they feel they're owed. But others, like Trebonius, like Decimus Brutus, they seem to be still doing quite well. Maybe they felt they could have done better and deserved better from Caesar. The decision seems to be, the key thing is that the Republic and they themselves, perhaps as individuals, would be better off if Caesar was no longer there, if there wasn't a dictator. Some of them seem to have arrived at this decision quite a while ago. They seem to have been upset, dissatisfied for quite a while. So, almost a year before, there's the tradition that Trebonius had sounded out Mark Antony about getting rid of Caesar. Now, that was back when Antony hadn't quite done as well as Caesar wanted him to. There'd been friction during Caesar's absence, and Antony was blamed for overreacting. So there's a breach between the two. We haven't got time to go into that in detail at the moment, and maybe they were thinking, well, Antony's got good reason not to like him anymore. However, Antony doesn't want to get involved and remains loyal, but also doesn't tell anybody about this afterwards. He doesn't go and tell Caesar that Trebonius is perhaps you can find in any group of people. How many people in the canteen or quietly together, or when they meet outside work, might be moaning about their boss, but they're not plotting to overthrow them or this sort of thing, and they still most of the time actually function perfectly well and do the job without them. People let off steam. You can have sour grapes, but they don't necessarily lead to anything, and that presumably is how Antony viewed this. The two leaders are men who fought against Caesar in the early stages of the civil war. Brutus surrendered after Pharsalus. His influence with Caesar helps Cassius to get a good reception as well. Now bear in mind, Cassius is Brutus's brother-in-law. He's married to Junia Tertia, one of Brutus's three sisters. 44 BC, both men are praetors, so they have office in the year when Caesar is murdered. Brutus has already been marked down for the consulship. According to Plutarch, Cassius was bitter because Brutus had been given the most prestigious of the praetorships, the praetor urbanus, the praetor of the city, and Caesar had chosen him, even though he's supposed to have said, Cassius has actually got the better case, but I'm so fond of Brutus that I'm going to give the prize to him. There's other talk, there's other sources of an old grudge against Caesar, that he'd, at some point, Caesar had confiscated animals that Cassius had gathered and brought to Rome for games he was going to stage, and Caesar confiscates them and he remains bitter about this. He certainly, again, the contrast is, we began with that quote where he's talking about Caesar as the old Clement master. So, he's not entirely happy with this, but nevertheless, of the choices, Gnaeus, Pompey or Caesar, I'm definitely going with Caesar. Partly out of self-preservation, because he feels that Gnaeus Pompey will hate him and express that hatred very forcibly. Cassius is an interesting chap. He doesn't get the level of detail, he doesn't get a Plutarch biography, for instance, unlike Brutus, though his name becomes associated with Brutus. Apart from being brothers-in-law, they haven't done that much together before this. His moment of glory, perhaps, but also to some extent of infamy, he was elected quaestor, allocated to Crassus when Crassus goes out to Syria to embark upon his expedition into Parthia. By the time that happens, by 53 in the Battle of Carrhae, there is a plausible school of thought that by this time Cassius should have been replaced by a new quaestor, but in fact has had his authority extended. He's become pro-quaestor. Not entirely clear, and we don't know too much about how that worked at that sort of level, but that's a possibility. But he's there at the Battle of Carrhae. He wrote an account of this afterwards, and that seems to have influenced other accounts like that of that have been lost, but were available to people like Plutarch. So there is a tradition within the account of Crassus's last campaign and the defeat at Carrhae and the retreat afterwards, where Cassius is the voice of sanity, and Crassus is doing all these making these bad decisions, and Cassius keeps suggesting, well, why don't we do this, with the implication that if we had, it all would have been all right. Now obviously if you survive and the man in charge dies, it's much easier for you to tell the story that way. Doesn't mean it's not true. It could be. Perhaps he did perceive that Crassus was making mistakes. Carrhae is a defeat, the army retreats afterwards and then starts to get pursued by the Parthians, who are very good at chasing down an army like this, because after all they're a lot more mobile than the Romans are. Fairly early on in the retreat, Cassius clears off with a force of cavalry and heads back to Syria and gets to Antioch. Now he saves that group of men, and obviously the situation was confusing, but there is possibly a defensive quality to his version of this campaign as well, in the sense that you could argue, well, he's abandoned his commander rather early on. Again, that's a criticism that's much easier to make from safety and afterwards. Nevertheless, it's the sort of thing that people are likely to talk about. Cassius goes back to Antioch as pro-quaestor or quaestor, whatever he was by this time. He's only a man in his early 30s, but he is the senior Roman official in that province. He rallies whatever stragglers come in, the bits and bobs of garrisons that were left behind, and make their way back, and becomes effectively governor of Syria for several years. He's still there in late 51 BC when Cicero arrives to govern Cilicia, the neighbouring province, and during those years he repulses at least one and possibly more large-scale Parthian raids, attacks into Syria. He manages to ambush part of the Parthian force outside Antioch. He defends the city, stops them getting in there, ambushes one of their forces, kills a senior commander, and wins enough of a victory to be presented as a victory to a Roman audience. So he's shown some talent, he's done what a Roman should, but also it's a sign, you could argue it's the same as Sulpicius Galba not getting elected, of how abnormal conditions are in that build-up to the civil war. And that really extends from the chaos after Clodius is killed by Milo, burning of the Senate House, the inability to hold elections, Pompey being appointed sole consul for 52, later on with this sort of interregnum period, this anarchy, where they have nobody there. A lot has happened that means that the Senate has not bothered to send a replacement out to Syria. There should be somebody more senior than this youngster by Roman standards who's got extended quaestorian imperium. He does a good job, but it's again Cicero in his letters from Cilicia sort of, we need to send a bigger army. There's a problem here. We've got to deal with this. You can't just let this trail off because things are dangerous. The Parthians are a major threat. So Cassius does all of that. We don't know so much about him. He's replaced by Bibulus, Caesar's old colleague in the consulship in 59 BC, who is married to Porcia, daughter of Cato the Elder. Cato the Younger, Cato Cassius. So there's a sort of family connection there because, of course, Cato is half-brother to Servilia, Brutus's mother. But bear in mind, while Cassius is married to Junia Tertia, Lepidus, Caesar's master of horses dictator, become one of the triumvirs with Antony and Octavian, he is married to another of the sisters. So, when they dine afterwards in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, this is a family get-together as well as a political thing. Now, Suetonius reports gossip that during, presumably, this period, that Caesar has slept with Junia Tertia, with Servilia's daughter, Brutus's sister, Cassius's wife, had an affair with her. Cicero coming out with the quip that when Servilia buys some property auctioned off from defeated and dead Pompeians, she gets it at a knockdown price, and Cicero says, you don't know the half of it, there's a third off. Tertia meaning third, because officially women don't require the detailed names of a man, and they're numbered or marked out in some other way. So you have 3 girls called Junia, officially. Obviously, their nearest and dearest would have ways of telling them apart. There may be no truth in that story. It could just be the sort of rumour that associated with Caesar. Again, Servilia is clearly not openly hostile to Caesar at this point. It doesn't really seem to be afterwards, but obviously she's also the mother of Brutus and guide, protector, promoter of her son's career. None of the sources attribute Cassius this sort of personal motive that basically Caesar's just slept with his wife. There's a whole soap opera quality about this, but it doesn't feature in the sources, though if it did happen, and that's a big if, you have to speculate whether that would surely have added some fuel to the fire. And again, even with Brutus, even though Caesar supposedly just had an affair with his sister, he's had a long-term on and off affair with his mother that seems to be more on than off, rumours about his paternity, all this sort of thing. That is not described as a major motive in his decision to act against Julius Caesar. Brutus does seem to be one of the last to join the conspiracy, and there's all the stories, again you get this reflected in Shakespeare, who gets it from Plutarch, slogans painted on the walls asking whether Brutus was asleep, because tradition was Rome's last king had been deposed by a Brutus, and it's not entirely clear there is a direct line of descent to our Brutus from that, but nevertheless, it's the sort of attribute that Roman aristocratic families like to promote, that we were the ones who were so devoted to service to the state that we would do anything, whatever was necessary, we would do the right thing. He's a keen student of philosophy, particularly Stoicism, which has this emphasis on stern duty. And of course, like all of his generation, to some extent for a generation or two before, this is a Roman aristocracy that has grown up being educated in the Greek tradition as well as the Roman. So the celebration of tyrannicides in Greek literature, in Greek culture, perhaps particularly Harmodius and Aristogeiton at Athens, who killed Hipparchus, one of the sons of Pisistratus, the Athenian tyrant of the 6th century BC, who became more important figures later because they killed the brother of the tyrant. They didn't kill the tyrant himself, or perhaps they were co-tyrants. There's all sorts of debate about that we don't need to worry about. They really get promoted after Athens becomes a democracy, and it's almost as if, because the last tyrant gets expelled by a Spartan army, and King Cleomenes of Sparta comes in and kicks him out, and then backs him up, but then turns against the regime that emerges afterwards because the man he's supported isn't in charge, and you have Cleisthenes and all this sort of stuff. Again, big, complicated story, stuff for another day. For the Athenians, as they become prouder and prouder of their democracy, they'd much prefer to remember homegrown freedom fighters than they would the foreign agency. So Harmodius and Aristogeiton get statues early on. The Persians take these away. They're replaced after the Xerxes' army has been repulsed, and eventually Alexander the Great will find them and send them back to Athens during his Persian campaigns. So they get the original ones as well. Thucydides is fairly scathing about the two and sort of saying, the tradition about them, people get things wrong. And the clear thing is that it takes several years after this murder for the tyrants to be thrown out and the tyranny to end. And as I say, that only happens because of Spartan military aid. So, however, they are celebrated in poetry, in song, in art, this sort of thing. It becomes the idea, and they're a very Greek thing because it's all based around, even their motives don't seem political, they seem more personal. It's to do with this sort of love triangle and all this sort of thing. So Brutus has got that going on in the background, that tyrannicides are held up by many of the authors he holds dear as highly admirable figures. Family pride's a big thing, but there's also this growing obsession, adulation of his uncle Cato. Now, Bibulus has died during the civil wars, Porcia is a widow, and Brutus marries her. So he's cousin to his wife. I mean, I'm not quite sure, because Cato is half-brother, half-sibling to Brutus's mother. I don't quite know what the child of a half-sibling is to you, is there a sort of grade of cousin or something? Anyway, whatever it is. Nevertheless, it's quite close. Not unknown in Roman circles, but still relatively unusual. Porcia is clearly rather a forceful individual, very much imbued with a sense of, after all, she's been married to someone who's one of the most inveterate Caesar haters. And her father has not accepted Caesar's clemency to the extent that he tries to kill himself, doesn't die of the wounds after stabbing himself in the stomach. His son comes in, gets a surgeon, treats him, and then Cato waits for everybody to go and then rips open the stitches, pours out his guts, and dies in this spectacularly gruesome fashion rather than accept Caesar's clemency. So not only has he opposed Caesar at every step of the way and made a whole career, to some extent, about being the opposite to Caesar, the opponent to Caesar, as he presents himself, he won't accept mercy. Brutus has that guilt element in that he has accepted Caesar's mercy and then done rather well, thank you very much, out of this. Caesar has made him governor of Cisalpine Gaul in the last few years. He's praetor now. He's marked out for the consulship. He is favoured. He is honoured. He is even given the post of praetor urbanus. So you've got that sense of you admire your uncle who has been this wonderful exemplar of traditional Roman virtue combined with the best that Greek thought has to offer, the best of Stoicism, that again only promotes that sense of duty, of honour, of doing the right thing regardless of the cost, and being utterly unshakable in that, refusing to budge an inch, no compromise whatsoever. And yet you have compromised, and you've done, again, very well out of it. So you've got this. Porcia probably reinforces that. There's several sources report this tale. She deliberately stabs herself in the thigh to prove that she could cope with pain and therefore deserved her husband's trust, whatever he was planning, taken into his confidence. She will later commit suicide. Given her history as well, and you've already buried one husband, your father's dead in this spectacular manner, lots of people have died in the last few years, killed by fellow Romans. She's taking that sort of Catonian sense of utter refusal to compromise to an extreme. Brutus has done rather well. Caesar supposedly comments that whatever Brutus wants, he wants badly. And Brutus does not appear in a very good light from Cicero's correspondence while Cicero is in Cilicia, where it's discovered that Brutus has loaned money, in particular to the city of Salamis on Cyprus, at 48% interest. Now, the legal rate was 12%, but he'd managed to get an exemption put in, supposedly, that he could charge more than that. So, 48% interest is pretty awful. Now, obviously, the people agreed to this, but they claim that they offer to pay it back at the legal rate and settle the matter. He refuses that. He's clearly desperate for money, bothered by this, but he repeatedly, first of all, it takes Cicero a while to realise that the agent that Brutus has recommended to him is in fact Brutus's agent, not just some friend. And then in the past, before Cicero gets there, this man has been given a troop of cavalry by the previous governor, Appius Claudius, again, aristocrat of the aristocrats, and has blockaded the High Council of Salamis within their Senate house until some of them starved to death. Cicero stops all of that, but Brutus has been trying to screw them for this 4 times the legal rate interest for a long time, and he will not compromise. He will not accept his money plus 12%, the legal rate, which they've deposited in a temple, is there waiting to be collected. He won't accept that. He wants the 48 and nothing else. Cicero, to his discredit, whilst he sort of says, I'm thinking far less of Brutus, instead of forcing him to accept that, lets the matter be held off until the next governor arrives, and Brutus has connections with this man, so he's probably going to get what he wants. Both Brutus and Cassius, after the murder of Caesar, will be pretty brutal in the way they raise funds and compel communities in the Eastern Mediterranean to do what they want in the preparation for the Philippi campaign. They don't behave any differently from the other warlords. There's lots of things going on. Deep down, though, it does seem to come back to this idea that this is not how the Republic should work. There shouldn't be one man in charge. That is probably the unifying cause, at least the open cause, and the one that they'll all say, this is why we're doing it. This is about liberty. This is about how a free republic. You can't have a free republic with a permanent dictator. Now, you could look at it and say, well, both Brutus, Marcus Brutus, and Decimus, Junius Brutus, give up consulships they've been marked down for. So they're both giving up a high honour that they will have. They could confidently predict that they'd win the magistracy anyway because of who they are. That's the thing. I mean, you have to remember these are Roman aristocrats, so if they succeed, if they kill Caesar, the Republic is restored, liberty is restored, everything goes back to normal elections with the aristocracy dominating because of they are the right-thinking chaps with all the connections, then these people will do well. So the conspirators do have, to a degree, personal advantage to gain from killing Caesar. They are likely to be the leaders of the Republic in the years to come. And that is something that is an important motivation for any Roman aristocrat. So, it's not entirely altruistic, but that doesn't mean that it isn't altruistic at all, and that they don't think that the cause is important. They resolved to act quickly since they knew Caesar's planning to leave Rome on the 18th of March. Not going to return for 3 years. He's marked out magistrates for that time, so everybody knows that. Probably encouraged by the hostility he'd encountered, the Flavus and Marullus incident, Lupercalia. As I say, Cicero will later claim that Antony was the true killer of Caesar because of the Lupercalia. So aware that Caesar's about to leave Rome, they decide to strike on the 15th, the Ides of March, when Caesar's expected to attend a meeting of the Senate. Felt that he'd be less on his guard. He's going to walk through the streets to get there on such an occasion. Again, you come into the stuff that's in Plutarch, that's in Shakespeare. There's reports, rumours of plots do seem to have reached Caesar, but vague, often implicated men like Antony and Dolabella as well as any of the real conspirators, because, the politics has been volatile. Antony isn't simply Caesar's man. Caesar dismissed them all, said to have stated he was far more to suspect that Cassius, with his serious nature, might be plotting against him rather than the wild living Brutus or Antony or Dolabella. Yon spare Cassius hath a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous in the Shakespearean version. It's that idea that again it comes from Plutarch. He's also supposed to have said that Brutus had enough sense not to want his carcass. Basically it comes back to this idea, the state needs me more than I need it. I've done enough. I've lived long enough. I've won enough glory. I'm tired. I'm fed up, but I'm still going to work and do a good job. And if anyone's got an ounce of sense, they'll let me do it because it's for the good of the Republic. You get all the prodigies, warning of the death of most powerful men. The famous one again comes from Shakespeare on the night of the 14th. Caesar's wife Calpurnia has a nightmare, claimed to have seen perhaps either the pediment of the house collapsing, because again they're in the Regia, this sort of semi-religious palace thing that has a pediment like a temple, or holding a murdered body of Caesar in her arms. The morning sacrifices on the 15th don't go well, repeated several times, unfavourable omens. The story of Caesar's surprised because his wife is nervous about this sort of thing. She's not normally given to superstition, and eventually she persuades him to stay at home, sends word to the Senate that ill health prevents him leaving his house for public business. But again, it's possible that he was slightly unwell because there's been various problems. And clearly he's, Cicero talks about having this course of emetics. He's doing things with his stomach and his digestion which can lead to unfortunate results. Antony's supposed to carry the message to the Senate, but before he leaves, Decimus Brutus arrives. Again, perfectly normal for friends to come and greet any important Roman in the morning. It's part of the normal morning procedure. You come, you go, and then sometimes you'll join one of your friends. He goes and sees somebody even more senior. It's custom. It's normal. So there's nothing unusual in this. They've also, both Caesar and Decimus Junius Brutus, they've both dined with Lepidus the night before. So again, Brutus's sister would have been there. Where during the meal, there's supposed to be the question raised of what's the best sort of death, and Caesar hadn't really been listening, but suddenly perks up and says, "Best death is an end that's sudden and unexpected." Again, how much of this is invented later? How much is simply remembered later because it's significant? On the 15th, Brutus, this is Decimus Brutus, is able to convince Caesar to attend the Senate. Plutarch says, he mocks the soothsayers and the idea that Caesar, who's always been a pretty pragmatic man in this respect, is bothered by this sort of thing. Plutarch also claims he lures Caesar with the claim that he was going to be offered a kingship outside Italy. Again, probably an invention. If Decimus Brutus tells this story after the Ides of March, well, what's he going to say? We had to kill him. It seems unlikely, particularly as he's only, he's 2 days away from going away. So it's all a bit sudden. But it has delayed things. It's late morning by the time Caesar walks the fairly short distance. You can walk it in, 10, 15 minutes or so today to the complex of temples abutting onto to Pompey's theatre. The first stone theatre in Rome. It's part of this big thing. It's got temples attached to it. It's all part of a sort of, as I say, a complex of buildings of which virtually nothing is left today. But you have the Area Sacra, which I think has been reopened now. Last time I was there, you could only peek through the fence to look at it. Where you have these several temples. It's in one of these that the Senate is meeting because the Curia, the Senate House, is under construction. The Curia Julia is being built. The old one had been burnt down when they cremated Clodius's remains. So the conspirators have had to wait a long time. So clearly this, again, it's all dramatic stuff, been pretty nervous time for them, waiting there, thinking, well, what's going on? Is he coming at all? Has the plot been exposed? What's going to happen to us? They've gathered early on the pretext that Cassius' son was formally becoming a man by, so putting away the bulla, the charm around his neck, adopting the toga virilis. Again, it's the sort of thing in the same way as going to greet Caesar in the morning and bid him good day. It's a normal Roman thing. It's a perfectly plausible thing. Then they go to the temple together as a group because they've all come from this, group and important family event. Daggers concealed in the cases in which they carry their long stylus pens. In the theatre itself, there's a troupe of gladiators owned by Decimus Brutus, armed and ready. Presumably some fight is going to be staged there in the near future. Again, any venue with seating is sometimes used for this sort of thing. So they've got a reason to be there, and it's all legitimate, but it's also taking care. It's a little bit dodgy because obviously, if you're carrying out this great movement for Roman liberty, it would be better not to be depending on gladiators, most of whom will be slaves, as your armed muscle, but nevertheless that's what you've got. You haven't been able to, or you haven't risked extending the conspiracy to get wider support from Romans. Somebody greets Brutus and Cassius in a way that seems strange, and then they think, well, have they been given away? And even worse, as Caesar arrived, this same chap goes up to him and has a chat with Caesar. It's only after a while they realise he's presenting a petition. But again, you can understand the nervousness. On the way, again, Caesar's been presented with a scroll by a Greek teacher who's worked for Brutus and been in his household, but doesn't seem to be anymore. Seems to have known of the conspiracy, but through choice, through lack of opportunity, for whatever reason, Caesar doesn't read it at that time. Again, it's all this sort of what concerns me most will be dealt with last. It's in Shakespeare. None of the sources suggest Caesar was in any way suspicious. You've got the business with the soothsayer, the Ides of March are come, I Caesar, but not gone. Again, it all comes from the Plutarch account. The conspirators greet him as he steps down from his litter. Trebonius, or in Plutarch's version, Decimus Brutus. So there's different traditions. Takes Antony, calls him off, says, can I have a quick word with you? And just leads him away, keeps him talking while Caesar and the remainder went in. So Antony and one of the leading conspirators is outside the temple, because Antony is Caesar's fellow consul. They've been reconciled for several months, and he's a big, tough guy that they're thinking, well, we don't have to handle him as well because this might be tricky. Caesar goes to the golden chair that's been voted to him, presumably next to Antony's consular curule chair, because he's the only, he's consul with Caesar. There's only two this year. There isn't dictator and two consuls. Before the meeting could begin. So it's in this sort of milling around stage as everybody's taking their seats, forming out, And again, remember, this is a social thing. A lot of people know each other well. They're going to be chatting. They're going to be asking about business, but also just the day-to-day stuff as it's going on. Lucius Tillius Cimber, who served with Caesar in the past, we don't know too much about him, goes up to Caesar and asks for the recall of his brother. Presumably had been on the other side, had been a Pompeian, and got to be a fairly ardent one not to have been recalled by this stage. The rest of them press round, implore Caesar to grant the plea, touching, kissing his hands. Publius Servilius Casca Longus, Casca of the stories, moves round to stand behind Caesar's chair. Again, a bit suspicious, but it's not obvious at that point. Caesar refuses to be moved, refutes the arguments calmly. Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga, pulled it down from his shoulder. That's supposedly the agreed signal. Casca drew his dagger, stabbed from behind, but in his nervousness only manages to graze the dictator's shoulder or neck. So, these are very excited, scared people doing this. Caesar turns, seems to have said something which translates like, if you'll pardon the vulgarity, bloody Casca, what are you playing at? It's a real sort of shock. What the so-and-so is going on? Some accounts, he grabs Casca's arm, tried to wrench the dagger away. Suetonius' version, he takes his own stylus pen, which is this long sort of shaft with a metal nib sharpened, or sometimes just sharpened on its own, and stabs Casca. Casca, Plutarch says that specifically that he uses Greek rather than Latin, calls for help to his brother. Again, so there's two from the family in there. So you've got these family connections all the way around with the conspirators. The others start stabbing, slashing at Caesar. It's all pretty wild. It's all confused. It's all panic. There's hysteria going on in the rest of the Senate. Nobody knows what's, everyone's shocked by this, terrified by this. Brutus gets accidentally wounded during the course of this by one of his fellow conspirators. So do several of the others, because they're struggling to get on one man. Only two senators try to help Caesar. They can't push their way through to him. So again, most of the Senate is just shocked, doesn't do anything, and there's only these two that actually act. Dictator struggled with them to the end, trying to fight or force his way out. Marcus Brutus stabbed him once in the groin, and some claim that when he saw Servilia's son, he stops, stares at him, and this is when you get the last words. You too, my son, kaisu teknon, is the, we get in the tradition, the et tu, Brute, is invented by Shakespeare or somebody else at that time, and you, Bruce. But it's the same idea, but then you can interpret this as, and you, my son, sort of, you too, my son, even you hate me, or, and you, my son, sort of thing. You can even take the Greek that way. So is he belligerent? Is he... Sometimes you see Caesar as sort of almost reconciled to death, martyrdom, that sort of thing. That's the image you get in a lot of the art and the on-screen presentation. The impression is that he fought to the very last. He then collapses, covers his head with his toga, with his last breaths, trying to look perhaps protection, perhaps trying to look more dignified, who knows. He's been wounded 23 times, although probably only one would have been fatal. So that's the culmination of it all, at which point virtually everybody panics, flees from the Senate House, or not from the Senate House, from the Senate's meeting, from this temple. The conspirators come out with their bloody daggers waving them around, proclaiming liberty. They go up to the Capitol and hole up there, guarded by the gladiators, and will lead on to the negotiations with Antony, with others, the funeral orations, Brutus's speech, Antony's speech. We don't have time for all of that today, but again, the Shakespearean version is pretty close to Plutarch and gives you a fair idea of what happened. It does seem to be one of those conspiracies where they had a bit of luck, but also Caesar was not taking precautions. Perhaps he didn't care. Perhaps he also felt that if he's going to leave Rome for 3 years, he has to brass it out. He has to act as if he has no real fears that anything bad will happen, that people will try to attack his regime. And comes back to this idea that he's presenting the view as, well, surely everybody can see I'm doing a good job. I'm getting the res publica, the Republic, working again as a state. Remember, we imbue the Republic with this constitutional idea. It's a more general term for the Romans. It's the Commonwealth. It's for the good of everything, the corporate identity of citizens. The conspirators see Caesar as the man who's destroyed this because of being dictator, whatever they, even a nice dictator, even a kind dictator, even an efficient dictator, there just shouldn't be a dictator. Rome, the Republic, should be guided by elected magistrates who are, oh, surprise, surprise, people like them from the best sort of families, right-thinking people. They clearly get the mood wrong. There is not an overwhelming resentment of Caesar within the wider population. And, this is seen very clearly when they simply don't get the support they expected. They've killed him for an aristocratic principle. It is not something that really has much concern for most other Romans. Even a lot of equestrians and people who are quite well off. You have the comment that... later on, in the aftermath, one of Caesar's friends talks about, if Caesar couldn't find a way out, who could? That sense everything's a mess, that nobody's really happy, nobody really likes, including Caesar, that there is a dictator, that there has to be, but they're trying to make the best of it, or trying to turn it to the best of it. So that's the story of the Ides of March and the assassination. As I say, we won't go on to the aftermath, that's a big tale, and we'll do that another time. We'll probably do something on Brutus in particular, maybe Cassius as well, in more detail at some other point. We might save these till March next year. We'll see how it goes. But anyway, that's our Ides of March special for March 2025. And there's much more detail than this in my book on Caesar, and plenty more in other people's who deal with these last months more than I do. I try to give a balanced account, giving the same amount of space to each phase of his life, rather than letting it be dominated by the assassination and his last days, his last months. It's a little bit like, do you tell Custer's life story and focus it all around Little Bighorn, or do you look at all the other things he did there? Is Napoleon all about Waterloo? No, clearly not. And Churchill is more than the Second World War, though that's very important. But he had big career before and something of a career afterwards as well. Though obviously, in a sense of it being the finest hour for the Empire and the Commonwealth, it's Churchill's finest hour as well. But there is the danger that these great moments draw so much attention that we lose a sense of proportion. This is something that happened in the last few months that Caesar spent in Rome and Italy after a very busy time fighting civil wars. It's a conspiracy that was put together. People like Brutus do seem to join quite late. Resentments came to a head, tipped over, but if Caesar had not gone to the meeting of the Senate on that morning, then there probably wouldn't have been another opportunity to kill him. He would have gone off, and we would have seen what would have happened if he'd gone on this expedition and what sort of regime might have developed, and history could have been very different. But history is about what happened and trying to understand it. So today we've looked at the last months, and particularly the assassination plot and how it all played out. But anyway, that's it. The Ides of March, the assassination of Julius Caesar. Thanks for watching.